This episode contains material that might be triggering for some. If you need to stop the podcast at any time to take care of yourself, please do so.
If you need support, you can call the 24/7 National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Dialectical behavior therapy was created in the 1980s by Marsha Linehan in Seattle, Washington.
Today, DBT is taught all over the world.
We're two therapists who believe everyone can benefit from DBT skills.
I'm Kate.
I'm Michelle.
And this is DBT and Me.
Hello, everyone, to our first monthly episode.
Woohoo!
Yeah, very, very exciting. As we talked about in our What Happens Next episode, we are, of course, still here with you guys. We're just here with you guys once a month instead of every week. However, coming into this monthly episode, we have a really big topic that we're going to start talking about. So this is actually going to be a two-parter, as we'll call it. And next month, we're going to have a second episode that follows up on what we're talking about in today's episode. And the topic of today is that we're going to talk a little bit more about borderline personality disorder. So this is something that we mentioned in our very first episode because ultimately DBT was developed and designed to treat borderline personality disorder. This was the diagnosis it was made for. And though it's been shown over the years that these skills and this way of viewing the world dialectically, these are super helpful things for anyone, people struggling with a variety of different mental health diagnoses. BPD is where it all started. And we have referenced BPD, I think especially in Q&A episodes it comes up because listeners will mention that they are diagnosed with BPD. Kate and I haven't talked about it too much when we're recording episodes that are just talking about various skills. But we thought this would be a good topic for a monthly episode. It's just talking more about the criteria for BPD and some different ways to view essentially why BPD occurs. Kate's going to be a little later in the episode. Kate's going to be talking about some of the neuroscience behind BPD, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about complex PTSD and how that relates to borderline personality disorder as a diagnosis. So next time when we record our episode next month, that episode is going to be about being the loved one of someone diagnosed with BPD. Because we have a lot of listeners who have shared with us that they fall into that category too, where it's their partner who's diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, or their child, or a parent, or someone who's close in their life having this diagnosis, and they are curious about DBT skills as a way to be a support for them. And also maybe hopefully finding that DBT is helpful for them, just being a loved one of someone with this diagnosis. So we're going to be talking about that next time. That's the second part of the two, is to talk about basically just when you're the loved one of someone with BPD, what are some things that can be helpful for you? And then the very last thing I'll say before we launch into this, Kate and I were acknowledging at the beginning, this is probably going to be a pretty long episode, you guys, so hang in there with us because there's a lot to talk about with this topic. And also, we want to finally just say that do not diagnose yourself. This is something that is talked about commonly in grad school programs when you are a student who is in school to become a therapist. I know they talked about it in my program, basically acknowledging that there can be this tendency to notice, hey, I checked that box, I checked that box, I must have this. And we can fall into diagnosing ourselves with various things. Do not diagnose yourself with borderline personality disorder. If as we're going through this today, you realize for yourself, I do check a lot of these boxes. If you're not already working with a therapist, find a therapist for yourself and talk about it with your therapist and get their opinion on whether they think you qualify for a diagnosis. So don't diagnose yourself. And also, I don't know, Kate and I are not here to diagnose any of you either. We do not know you. We do not know your story. So, yes, if you have questions about this after the episode, you can absolutely send us questions and post in the Facebook group and all of that stuff. And also, if you're like, hey, do you guys think I have BPD? We don't know. We can't tell you because you are not our clients. So this is purely here just to give information that you can then check out with a therapist yourself. Also, this may be helpful if, let's say, you've been already diagnosed by a therapist. The therapist has told you that you do have BPD. Then this information will hopefully be helpful for you to get a more full understanding of what that means and what that looks like. But it is not our job. We are not in our role as therapists when we do the podcast. We are just here to give information, not to treat, not to diagnose, none of that stuff. So that's kind of our disclaimer as we move into this episode too. And we're going to kick it off with Kate sharing a little bit personally about BPD stuff, I guess we could say.
Yeah, and I will jump into that in just a second. I did want to add two things. One, I just think it's funny because when you were talking about it being our first monthly episode, I was like, oh, that's our excuse for it being really long now. Like, you guys are only hearing from us once a month. We can talk for as long as we goddamn well please.
Very true.
So that just occurred to me, and I thought it was funny. It's not actually relevant, but I thought it was amusing. The other thing was you were talking about going through the diagnostic criteria, but you didn't mention that we're going to talk about how different DBT skills relate to those different criteria.
Yes, we are.
Which was actually, I think, the thing that sort of prompted us to do this whole thing to begin with. Was someone was like, you don't talk much about how the skills relate particularly to DBT, or to BPD, which is the thing they were created for. Could you talk about that? We're like, oh, I guess we could.
Yep.
So we will be trying to pull in different specific DBT skills that can be used to address each of the specific diagnostic criteria.
Yes, we will. Thank you for adding that on because I did forget that piece that's going to be coming up in this episode.
So BPD and me.
Here you go.
Sorry, that cracks me up. So I know that I mentioned probably in the first episode even that I went through a DBT program when I was 19 years old. That included I think full year of, oh god damn it. There we go. Okay,
Bless
sorry.
you.
I knew that was going to happen. Anyway, I went through a program that was a full year of weekly, I think 2-hour long group DBT sessions and a 1 hour a week with an individual DBT therapist, the whole 9 yards, a really formal DBT program. The reason for that is because at 19, I was diagnosed with having borderline personality disorder. Before that, I think I had to get that diagnosis actually, now that I think about it, to get into that program. DBT was still kind of young. And most people weren't using it to treat much other than BPD still when I was doing this. So I believe that I think at the time it was called the Center for Dialectical Behavioral Therapy in Seattle. I think it's called something else now, like the Evidence-Based Treatment Center of Seattle or something like that. Anyway, I don't think they were taking anybody who didn't have a BPD diagnosis. So I'd had enough symptoms, self-harm, other things, that I guess my aunt watched a whole video by Marsha Linehan and was like, that sounds like Kate. So I got sent to, I think it was a psychologist. This was a while ago, folks, so bear with me. Well, you don't know if there's inaccuracies. Ha! Just stick with me while I remember it, I guess. So, and I took I think it was probably now like the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory? Is that the name of the test, Michelle?
Yeah, the MMPI.
Yeah, the MMPI. And I got diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. So that's what led to my going through DBT, etc. in the first place. And I certainly, in many ways, checked these boxes that we're about to go through at the time. Later, actually, when I was in grad school, I started seeing the therapist that I'm seeing now, and she had a different take on it. She believed that the BPD diagnosis was not accurate for me, and instead I had a lot of these symptoms or these sort of behaviors because my mom has borderline personality disorder. And so being raised by someone with these problems, a lot of it rubbed off on me, essentially, right? We often end up a lot like our parents in certain ways, as you may have noticed. Though even at the time when I did have the diagnosis, it was interesting how people will make something fit a story, because my therapist at the time said that I had a lot of BPD symptoms, but like inverted, like the same problem, but a different response to them, because I was trying not to be like, the things I saw my mother do that seemed to really hurt her or, negatively impact her life. Now as a therapist myself, I would say maybe that just means I didn't have the goddamn symptom person, but whatever. I still am so glad that I got into DBT it's irrelevant. And I think also because I spent so many years of my life viewing myself through the lens of thinking that I had borderline personality disorder, I think that has helped me have a considerable amount of empathy for folks who do, and also made me pretty fierce in my grad school program when I was confronted with the stigma still that is often crops up when you're being taught, even still in grad school. Maybe not. It's been a few years, several years since I graduated. Maybe it's gotten better, but at the time I still ran into teachers and even some of our books and other materials being pretty disparaging about that diagnosis. And because I believed that was an accurate diagnosis for myself at the time, I did not take well to that. And so I think I was a pretty fierce advocate for destigmatizing it. So yeah, I think I'll go more into my experiences, I think, with my mom having borderline personality disorder on the next episode, since that's specifically about having someone you love have that. So I'll save that part of my story more in depth for then. But I guess what I want to say is, to one degree or another, I have a lot of firsthand experience with these criteria, both lived and I guess what would the right word be? Vicariously experienced through witnessing them with my mom. So, yeah. Is there anything I'm leaving out that you thought I would talk about, Michelle? I feel, by the way, let me just own this. I feel a little scatterbrained today for some reason. I'm not sure why. But if you notice me checking in with Michelle, I'm seeing if I'm forgetting stuff. That's probably why.
And no, I think that was perfect with what you shared.
Awesome. So, do you want to dive in, Michelle, as we begin our deep dive into the diagnostic criteria?
Yes. And a couple caveats before we do this. So, we're going to be going over the 9 criteria of BPD. So, in the book that is called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I almost never say the full thing. This is why the mental health field has so many acronyms, you guys.
Like the MMPI. I could tell you it's the MMPI, but I had to stop and think for a minute for what the fuck that stood for.
What it stands for, yeah. Because we have all these big, long words, and so we just shorten it down to acronyms. But the DSM is essentially the guidebook of what diagnostic criteria fits for the mental health diagnoses that exist. And it's a really huge, big book that therapists all around the world use to diagnose clients that they are working with various mental health disorders as that fits. So Kate and I are going to go through, and we're going to alternate in talking about the 9 different criteria. Now, with this, we are going to be reading what the DSM says verbatim. So these are not Kate and I's words. This is the DSM. This is how they spell out each of these 9 criteria. And the other thing that I'll also say before we start is that if somebody does meet criteria for a diagnosis of BPD, that means that they are checking 5 out of the 9 boxes here. So it doesn't matter which 5, any 5. And they can receive a diagnosis. But again, like I said at the beginning, that's for a mental health provider to determine. Not for you to decide yourself, but this is information that you can take to them and check out and get their opinion on. Because like Kate said in her story, her therapist who actually started working with her and really got to get to know her realized, maybe you're not meeting full criteria for this. And let's view it through a different lens. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to go back and forth. We're going to read the criteria as it is written in the DSM. And then we're going to share what DBT skills are helpful for that specific piece. So I am going to get that started. And the first criteria is frantic effort to avoid real or imagined abandonment. So even though someone diagnosed with BPD can check any of these boxes, they might not check this box. I would argue this is probably the most commonly checked box when it comes to receiving a BPD diagnosis, is that when there are concerns about being abandoned by someone, whether that's a romantic partner, a friend, a family member, if those fears start arising up, there's efforts to try to not have that happen. And sometimes those fears about abandonment are real and legitimate. That person is actually abandoning you. They are leaving, they are ending the relationship, or whatever it may be. Other times, that's not the case. The person is not abandoning you. It just feels that way. And you still want to try to stop that if that's how it's feeling. So that's what we're talking about with this criteria. And the DBT skills that Kate and I think are most helpful is to first check the facts. Because as it says, it can be either real or imagined abandonment. So if you use check the facts and pause and do that, either, again, with an actual worksheet if you wanted to, or just kind of mentally in your head, asking some of those check the facts type of questions, that may help you determine, is this real abandonment or is this imagined abandonment? And help you tell the difference a little bit, because the two can feel the same. Even if the person is not actually abandoning you, it can really, really feel like that. And so check the facts can help bring you back down a little bit and see, okay, what's actually going on here. So that's a really helpful skill. If you notice these worries and these fears coming up, someone's mad at me, someone doesn't want to talk to me, those types of things, let's check the facts there of, is that really true? And the other skill that we think can be helpful, because unfortunately sometimes that may be true. The person may say that they want this relationship to be over. They may say, I am mad at you and I don't want to talk to you right now. It may be true that the relationship has some kind of rift in it and you're not sure what it looks like to get it back. Because, abandonment and conflict are two different things, but conflict can certainly feel like abandonment, and sometimes conflict can lead to a relationship getting permanently severed. And so if that happens, if a relationship is actually being severed or that kind of a thing, radical acceptance is probably the best skill to go to at that point. Okay, so this person has said that they want a divorce and they don't want to be in a relationship with you anymore. They've said that. Now what? And radical acceptance, whenever we're experiencing any kind of loss, can be a very important go-to skill. So that certainly applies if you are losing a relationship, or it's at least experiencing a disruption, so that you might not have this person in your life for a time the way you normally would. Radically accepting that can be helpful in figuring out then what comes next. We have to first radically accept what is before we can determine our next steps. So those are the two skills for that one, is check the facts and radical acceptance.
Perfect. All right, so the next criteria that's listed in the DSM is stated as a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. Isn't that a mouthful?
Mm-hmm.
Right, this, I think, think is really meaning to lean into the sort of black, sorry, I'm going to hate this every time I say this now, black and white
Black
think.
or
Right,
white.
That's what it ought to be. It ought to be black or white. Oh, well, anyway, that's sort of black and white thinking that is often a sort of layman's thing that they come up with for what borderline personality looks like, right? Very black and white, either or thinking. But as it's applied to people, right? So there's this idea that if someone has just been harmful to you, they are entirely a bad person. Right? Or if this person is being kind and loving to you, they are an amazing, wonderful, best person you've ever met. But, great people sometimes hurt us, and awful people sometimes do nice things. And so this can lead to a lot of very violent sort of back and forth ways of feeling in our relationships. And when we're feeling that way, that often leads to behavior that can be really hard, right? We'll go into that, I think, more in the next episode when we talk about having a loved one who suffers from this, because that can be certainly something that's hard to be on the receiving end of. It's also really hard to feel really hot, cold towards the people that we're intimate with in life. So what I think about as being good skills to help with this, I'm listing them as two separate skills, but they really go really well together. The first one, of course, is wise mind, right? This idea of synthesis, of balance, of bringing in our logic and our emotions to the moment and seeing what we can glean from both of them. Maybe sometimes someone has just done something so awful that a complete and total fuck you is the more or less appropriate response. But oftentimes it's not, right? So for bringing more of that rational mind in, we can be like, all right, yeah, my partner was just a total dick. But on average, over the last X number of years that I've been with them, they've been a pretty good person, right? That's what my logic, my rational mind can bring into it is, hey, let's step outside of this moment and look at the bigger picture, right? And so that, I think, is a really big thing that wise mind can bring, because many of the criteria lean on being more in the emotion mind on average, but this one especially, I think, can be seen as being just living at the whims of our emotion mind in the moment and kind of inappropriately expanding our current experience out through time. Whatever I'm feeling about this person right now is who they are now, how they have always been, and who they always will be. As opposed to recognizing that this is a moment, right? This is just now, and the past has had lots of things that were different from this moment, and I can't know shit about the future. Right? So I think wise mind is one of the first places that I go when I think about helping with this kind of place. And slightly separate from, but also somewhat integrated into that, is just the idea of dialectics as a whole. Being able to recognize that, again, pretty much everybody has an amount of goodness and an amount of quote-unquote badness in them. And so being able to lean into the dialectic of, to use the spouse example again, all right, my spouse can have been a dick right now and still overarchingly be a good spouse, right? To be able to hold on to both truths at the same time rather than having to pick one or the other. And so I think bringing dialectics into our relationships for folks with this diagnosis can be really, really soothing in a sense, right? To get rid of that sense that you have to pick, right? That things can be both. Someone can be awful right now and great overall. Someone can be great right now and awful overall, right? I think we lean into this idea of shitting on people who don't deserve it when we think about this criteria, but can also mean getting too close or staying too close with someone who doesn't really deserve it because of how they're being in this moment. So wise mind and dialectics, that's what I think about for that particular diagnostic criteria / symptom.
Nice. So the next one says that it is identity disturbance. They describe this as markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. So something that can come up with BPD This is true across the board. This is part of being human, is that we adjust and adapt depending on the environments that we're in and the people we're around. The way that you look when you're at your job is probably different than how you look with a night out with friends. That's completely natural. That's completely normal. It would actually be much more problematic if you were the same in both settings. So we adapt, and we have slight shifts in what sides of ourselves we show depending on who we're with. However, somebody diagnosed with BPD is going to potentially be more of a chameleon. More of a, I have to be who this person wants me to be, or who I think I'm supposed to be. And a lot of this can come from the first criteria that I mentioned is, this really intense fear that people aren't going to like me, that I'm going to be abandoned. They're going to leave me. They're going to get upset with me. So I have to adjust myself to be whoever they want me to be, whoever I think I'm supposed to be. And doing this can sometimes also actually play into what Kate was just describing with the pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships. That can be challenging sometimes for partners when the person diagnosed with BPD might seem to vastly change and shift who they are or how they present themselves depending on the situation at hand. A lot of times with the clients I've worked with the BPD diagnosis, it really is not uncommon to hear them say, like, I don't feel like I really know who I am. I don't know, like, if nobody else were around, or who do I like to be, or that kind of a thing. They struggle to answer those types of questions because, maybe out of necessity, which I'll talk about a little bit more when I get to the complex PTSD stuff and how childhood trauma can impact being diagnosed with BPD. But sometimes they've had to do this to survive, depending on what their circumstances are. They've had to kind of just really blend into the background to avoid abuse or that kind of a thing. But this can be really hard for someone with BPD to be able to talk about, is like who they think they really are. So what do we do about this? Well, one thing that can be really helpful is some mindfulness. So how can this be helpful? Mindfulness, when we really break it down, is about observing, describing, and participating. And that can be both noticing what is in our external environment and also being observers of what's going on internally for us. Noticing how our bodies feel physically, noticing what emotions we're experiencing, noticing what thoughts we're having. All of this helps us get to know ourselves and can create a more stable self-image, you could say. If we are not being mindful of what is going on internally, we're not getting to know ourselves very well. It's like the same way you get to know a person. You listen, you ask them questions about themselves. This is kind of you doing that to yourself when you're practicing mindfulness.
When you're getting to know a person, I'm pretty sure they're a person too.
When you get to know someone else.
I know. I know what you meant.
I did phrase it a little funny. But yeah, that mindfulness helps us do that with our own selves, to notice what we are feeling, what we are thinking, and how we're responding in the environment that we're in. It helps us be a little more present because, again, this is a pretty natural thing with or without a BPD diagnosis, but to really get stuck in either the past or the future, that can certainly happen with BPD. And so mindfulness is about just being in the now, noticing what is non-judgmentally, and that can be a really helpful way to get to know yourself. Another skill that Kate and I thought might be helpful is ABC, because ABC talks about values, and ABC talks about accumulating, right, the A, accumulating these long-term positive experiences and essentially having a sense of purpose in the world. And that can all be really helpful stuff too, to help get acquainted with ourselves. Also included with ABC is like the really big, long, pleasant events list, because that's accumulating short-term pleasant events. So there's lots of things that when you go through the ABC skill, especially the A part of it, it can help you get to know yourself. And how I think of this a little bit is, if you guys have seen the movie Inside Out, If you have not, go watch Inside Out. If you have Disney Plus, you can watch Inside Out because it's a Pixar movie. Watch Inside Out. And I won't say too much about it, but the general premise of it is that the whole movie takes place inside this girl's brain. Her name is Riley, and she's like, I think 11-ish. And the whole movie is inside her head. And it shows like what her emotions are doing inside her brain. And also they talk about this concept of having islands. So for Riley, she has Goofball Island, and she has Hockey Island because she loves to play hockey, and she has Family Island because she loves to spend time with her family. And she has, I think, five different islands that are like the key parts of her personality and her life. So for me, like an island that I have, that I've shared before on the podcast, is I have Ballet Island, right? Because I danced for a long time, and I still have that island. Even though I don't dance anymore, I still try to attend the ballet. Stupid COVID taking away live performing arts. Anyways, it's another matter. But I read dance magazines. I watch dance performances. I still have Ballet Island for myself. That's a key thing for me. And so someone with BPD might really struggle to know what are their islands, what are the things that are really important to them, or what are their personality traits that are really key to who they are. And ABC, again, particularly the A, can help develop that, or even just thinking of it in this framework that Inside Out talks about it as just having islands. That's really the antidote to this criteria, is being able to have some key things that you know are part of who you are at your core. So that's what we recommend for that one.
I like it. All right, on to the next.
Yes.
Mine reads, impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially damaging. I will say that this does not include self-harm impulsivity. That's covered by another one. I actually think the next one. And amusingly, Michelle, the one that you argued that the top one was the most commonly checked box. I don't know if the self-harm one is the most commonly checked, but I do think it's the most diagnostically leaned on.
Yes, for
I've
sure.
certainly had tons of people who utterly equated the two. That you don't self-harm if you don't have BPD. Like, that those are like a one-to-one thing. Anyway, speaking of grouchiness about things, like, they're not one and the same. Anyway, so, impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. This can look like spending habits that are harming you, or gambling, which is another way of spending, but an impulsive behavior. This could look like reckless driving. This can look like sexual behaviors that are unsafe. This can look like all sorts of things, right? This is just the idea that we have a hard time not doing the thing that we want to do, even if it's going to hurt us, literally or more figuratively, whatever the harm may be. So broad that I even have a hard time being more specific about it, but it really is just a struggle with not doing the things that we have strong impulses to do, whatever those may look like. The 2 skills that I think about as being most related for this is, one, pros and cons. I would say the pros and cons in many ways was this is it. This is why. It
was designed for this piece of things.
Designed for this specific one. This is the why for pros and cons being a DBT skill. So, right, pros and cons. I guess we don't need to say this every time. We have a whole episode for that because I think we do all of these. So, but the pros and cons are a little bit different with DBT than they might be otherwise. But it's great, right? It's a wonderful thing to go through. It's a lovely thing to carry around with you if you know that this is a thing that really, I don't know, is a strong thing for you personally. Again, whether you have BPD or not, if impulsivity is a thing that you struggle with, pros and cons, and having access to a pros and cons that you wrote out and did at another time, keeping that with you in your phone or in your car or something like that is a lovely thing to help combat that impulsivity. The other skill that I think of regarding this one is self-soothing with the 5 senses, right? A lot of times that impulsivity is being brought about by some sort of distressing emotional state. right? We're engaging in this impulsive action to self-soothe anyway, right? I'm upset, so I'm going to go out drinking. I'm upset, so I'm just going to spend an hour on eBay. I'm hurting, so I'm going to go gamble because it's distracting, right? These are our unskilled attempts to self-soothe. So I think that intentional, deliberate self-soothing for the emotional distress can often head the impulsivity off at the pass, right? If we take care of what is riling us up, or what we're trying to avoid, or what we're trying to soothe, or what we're trying to distract from, suddenly the impulsivity goes away, right? Because there's nothing there anymore for it to solve. So those are the two skills that I think about for helping with that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So as Kate mentioned, when it comes to the criteria for diagnosing BPD, they do have a separate one, which I'm about to talk about, related to self-harm. So, it's having impulsivity in at least 2 areas for what Kate was talking about that are, and those areas are not self-harming. And then this is separate. So it reads, recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures, or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. So there's a couple key things that I want to hone in on here. The first is that it says recurrent. So if you're like, well, I've had a time in my life where I was, and it's not even really even talking about suicidal thoughts. It's talking about behavior, gestures, threats. That's what it's talking about. So if you're like, well, I did attempt suicide once and I haven't, 15 years have gone by and I haven't attempted since. Nope. You wouldn't check this box. What they mean really by recurrent is that there's some kind of pattern. And that pattern might look different for everyone. For some people, this might look like multiple times a day that they are self-harming. For other people, this might look like every month or even once or twice a year. But if it's coming back up again and again with some regularity, you're checking this box. I will also get up on the high horse that Kate was just on a little bit, which is that there is still, I think, in the mental health field, which is not correct, that people think if you self-harm, that means you qualify for a BPD diagnosis. And that's not true. I work with lots of people diagnosed with BPD who don't self-harm.
My mom
and there are lots of people who self-harm. Huh?
My mom never did.
Yeah.
Yep.
And there's lots of people who self-harm who do not meet this criteria that we're going over today for BPD. So this is just 1 out of 9. And that feels really important to emphasize. So I also want to hone in on a little bit of what it says, like self-mutilating behavior, because a lot of people, I think, stereotypically think about that as cutting with a sharp object. Sometimes people think of it even more specifically as cutting your wrists. And Lord knows, I learned when I worked at Phoenix House, this can look a variety of different ways. This can look like cutting on any area of your body. This can look like, actually pretty common that people don't really talk about, hitting yourself. Mm-hmm. Or hitting like your head against a wall, or hitting yourself with objects. That would qualify. This can look like burning yourself. This can look like trying to strangle yourself. This can look like a lot of different things beyond just cutting for what we're talking about with self-mutilating behavior. It's anything that you are doing with the intention of causing physical bodily harm to yourself, whether or not you're intending to kill yourself. So there's a lot of things that fall under that definition. So what skills could be helpful with this? To echo what Kate just said, pros and cons was designed for this one too. So pros and cons is probably the go-to. Kate and I also really like opposite action for this skill, for this criteria. Because it's one of those things that this is what you have perhaps been going to for a long time when you feel a certain emotion, right? You feel shame, go to self-harm. You feel anger, you go to self-harm. You feel these emotions. And one of the things, if you go way back to the opposite action episode, right? I think we talked about that decision-making tree of like, even if your emotion fits the facts, is acting on that emotion effective? And self-harm is not effective. That is not to say that it does not. There are many reasons why it happens. There are many reasons and benefits that people get from self-harming. It's one of the things I talk about actually pretty in depth with my clients when they share this with me. What do you know, there's a reason for it. And Kate's talked about this quite a bit from her own personal experience. And so there's many reasons that people do it. And also it will, you know, by and large, whatever event took place that created that emotion in the first place, self-harming is not going to typically be an effective response to that thing that happened. So what else can we do? And that's what opposite action is all about. Okay, so I feel shame. I want to self-harm. Self-harming is not going to, I don't know, necessarily do anything about the thing that created the feeling of shame in the first place. What can I do with my feeling of shame instead? Maybe I can go, as Kate was talking about with impulsivity, maybe I go self-soothe myself in other ways. So opposite action can be helpful to just look at what else can I do so that I'm not turning to self-harm. We also think accepts is super helpful for this too, because the accepts acronym is all about distraction. So when that urge is really strongly there to self-harm, doing at least one of the parts of accepts can be really helpful. And I think that also almost in a way plays into just urge surfing, right? Because there's this urge to self-harm, and then while you're surfing that urge, you're probably finding some other things to keep you occupied to some degree or another, while that urge is still there. You know, using accepts is kind of like your surfboard to help you ride that wave while it's coming up really strongly that this is what you want to turn to. So there's lots of skills, because again, DBT for a long time, as Kate mentioned, it was like, oh my gosh, you're self-harming, go to a DBT group. That's what it was for many, 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 many years. And unfortunately, still some of that still lingers in the mental health community. So there's lots of skills that are designed for this. And Kate, I want to pause, because even though I know we're not responding too much to what the other person says, especially because you've shared a lot about your personal experience with self-harm, I want to pause before we move on to yours to see if there's anything else you want to say about this criteria or the skills that are most helpful for it.
Gosh, that's a good question. I think, we talked about, what the different skills and stuff were that we wanted to do for each of these criteria when we were kind of marking out our notes. So I do tend to agree with that. We mentioned ride the wave. In my next one. And you mentioned it a little bit as the accepts as the urge surfing, but I do think that that's one of the most important things, is teaching yourself that you're capable of tolerating whatever the emotion is that's driving you to do the thing. Because my lived experience of it, at least, is that one of the biggest motivators for self-harm was the intense belief, even though if you asked me to defend it logically, I could not, but the intense belief that all right, I'll be even honest, I used to think, not logically, but there was a part of me that thought the emotion would kill me, literally. But bare minimum that I couldn't tolerate it, that I was literally incapable of tolerating living in that feeling any longer, and so I needed to do whatever I could to make it stop. And there are a number of mostly physiological reasons that cutting or other self-harm behaviors can do that. And so I would just say that, whatever works to get you through that, but just learning that you can tolerate that emotion. Because that's the only way you can talk to the non-logical part of your brain. It's by actually experiencing it. You're never going to talk it out of it. I was never going to be able to logic my way out of the belief that an emotion would kill me, because I didn't logic my way into it. So I was not going to logic my way out of it. So you have to have a lived experience of tolerating that at some point. So that'd be kind of what I would say there. But otherwise, I think you've talked about it really well. And I will just say, from you and from anybody, I always appreciate people who are willing to admit the benefits, right? The things that you get from self-harm. So many people want to make it out to be, I don't know, dumb, stupid, ridiculous. Why would you ever do that?
There's just no good reason to do
exactly.
this. But as you said, it's the physiological stuff.
Yep.
It's the physiological reaction for why it is a thing that so many people do.
Yeah, I suspect a lot of people, like I did, stumble into it. Right? You learn in some sort of weird way, like you lash out maybe and you hit your hand on something and that causes a lot of pain, and suddenly you're not having the same emotion you were, a second ago, and you're like, hey, really? You don't say. Pain makes me stop having feelings, and an unfortunate pattern is born. So I just always appreciate people who are willing to admit that, because there's also a lot of like, oh my gosh, if we ever admit that they get anything out of it, we're just encouraging doing it. No, you're not.
Yep.
Anybody doing that already knows that they get something out of it.
Yeah.
So if you don't admit that, you're untrustworthy, is my opinion on the subject. So, all right. So, I get to be on a high horse next. I have a few high horses.
Yes, you do.
When it comes to this. So the next criteria is affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood. So much to say here. Affective instability is really just your emotions are kind of all over the place. You're really reactive. Something happens that most people would expect to get a tiny little response, and you fly off the handle, go through the roof, crash and crumble, right? Whatever. Right? There's this idea that there's a really large emotional response to external and internal stimuli, as well as it just seems, it's just unstable, right? Like nobody, like sort of unpredictable, I guess is maybe what I think they often mean by that. One way that I used to describe it when I was living with the diagnosis of BPD was that everyone else's 1 to 10 emotional scale started, at a 1, as it would sound like, 1 to 10. And my emotional scale started at a 4. Like the smallest emotional reaction I was capable of was almost halfway up most other people's scales, and it just went up from there. Right? And it wasn't a, choice. It wasn't a I am going to deliberately blow this out of proportion. Right? I'm going to go more into the neuroscience stuff in a little bit, but there are literal physiological reasons that people with BPD have these larger and more intense emotional responses. So we'll get into that more. But my first high horse, this does not mean bipolar disorder. That is different. These are like in the moment and generally not very long lasting emotions when we're talking about this affective instability. Hours maybe, right? Not saying it's gone in 30 seconds, but not days, weeks, months. Right, like manic episodes or depressive episodes are by people with bipolar disorder, right? So this is a much faster shifting emotional response than on average for bipolar disorder. It's just something that also gets misdiagnosed, especially in men. So my high horse comes to the fact that women get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder a whole lot more often than men, and I think this criteria especially is one of the big reasons for that, right? Women are the ones that are over emotional.
Hysteria, right?
Yes, right.
That's where like the whole mental health field kind of, well, one of the reasons why it got started was like women have hysterics. That's the term they used to use.
Have you ever noticed how hysteria and hysterectomy have the same root? That's not an accident. Hysteria was just a wandering womb. They used to think our uteruses meandered about our bodies and got up to mischief. Drives me out of my actual mind. Anyway, so because of this, oftentimes I would say that men do get, men with borderline personality disorder, I think one of the more common misdiagnoses, whoa, I cannot make that word come out of my mouth right. one of the more common things they get misdiagnosed with is bipolar disorder, because that's a, emotion dysregulation thing that apparently it's acceptable to consider men as having, whereas BPD is seen as kind of a woman's malady, which is not accurate. So there's my high horse around that one. Oh, if it's feelings, it must be lady problems. So moving on to the skills. There are, I guess I came up with we came up with three different ones for this. One is ride the wave, right? There's these big emotional responses that happen. Often at the peak of those emotional responses, there may be temptations for things in the past two criteria, either the self-harming behavior or other impulsive behaviors that might be damaging. So ride the wave can be a way to get through or over the peak, right, of that emotional response without taking actions that we might later find that we regret. Another one is tip. I think that's a lovely alternative, especially to self-harm, right? It does a lot of the same physiological things that people who self-harm are looking for, right? It's a bit of a shock to the physical system that can basically knock us off of the emotional track that we're on. So tip, absolutely, I think is huge for helping to deal with some of those huge moods, huge emotional reactions that can come with this. And then to make yourself less, order of events, Kate, please is the other skill that I think of for this one, but that's not an in-the-moment fix-it skill. That's a preemptively try and head it off at the pass from happening skill, right? We are less vulnerable to that reactivity or that affective instability if please is relatively well taken care of. As Michelle and I say all the time, no one's perfect at everything at please at all times. That just doesn't happen. But if you're tending to the component elements of please, you're gonna be less vulnerable for this, for these intense emotions. So yeah, ride the wave, tip, and please are what I think of for that. I know that we both had a bit of a high horse on that particular one. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that before moving on, Michelle?
No, I think just the biggest thing, like you said, is because people throw out this term a lot. I mean, people do it too. I even do it sometimes as a therapist, which I'm like, oh gosh, I get a little bit hard on myself when I do this. Right? People will be like, oh my gosh, I'm just so OCD about this. OCD is a horrifying diagnosis to live with. Let's be clear. Or people will be like, oh my gosh, I'm so bipolar today.
Oh, or manic today? No, you aren't.
Yeah. Here's the thing about bipolar disorder. Like, though it looks different for everyone, as Kate said and touched on, right? When someone is diagnosed with bipolar disorder for days at a time or weeks at a time, sometimes months at a time, they are either manic or depressed. And so when we throw out that term, oh, that person's so bipolar, right? They're just happy one minute, sad the next. That's not bipolar disorder. That is not. That is maybe a little more of what Kate was talking about, right? Is like that potentially like unstable, really fluctuating mood throughout the day of like, whoa, you know, an hour ago you were on top of the world and now you're crying in a corner. What's going on there? That's more what Kate was talking about with that criteria. But that is not bipolar disorder, and that gets misused a lot. So
yeah, my understanding even is that rapid cycling bipolar disorder even isn't that fast, right?
So, that's still way too fast. Yep. Exactly. So different things, people. Okay. So yeah, moving on to the next one of mine, which was probably one of the shortest criteria on here. It just says chronic feelings of emptiness. So this can have some overlap with criteria for depression, right? If somebody is in a depressed state, they often describe feeling empty. I think it's also still a really common stereotype out there that depression looks like sadness. For some people, yes. But a lot of people far more often describe it as numb empty, hopeless, those types of words, right? So this says chronic feelings of emptiness, and this can encompass just kind of this sense of feeling like, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't find it. Maybe you can help me out, Kate. When you're just not enjoying things as much.
Oh, anhedonia.
Thank you. Anhedonia. Yep, that's the fancy word for that, if you all were curious. Where, this can look like having a hard time getting out of bed, struggling to enjoy things. Chronic feelings of emptiness can encompass that. So it can look like a number of things, but that's generally at the core of it, is just this feeling of being empty, kind of hopeless, purposelessness, that kind of a thing. So what can help with this? Well, Kate and I really like Half Smile and Willing Hands. They are simple. They are easy. And that's something that I think is really important when it comes to struggling with depression. A lot of times we tend to jump to, I had a client say this to me once, how her doctor had recommended yoga for her when struggling with depression, leaving out some of the chronic pain stuff that my client deals with, which yoga may not be the best fit for because of that. But anyways, my client was just like, kind of flabbergasted of like, that's way too high of a bar to set for me. I think we can do this sometimes when people are in a depressed state, is set a really high bar for what they're supposed to do. Well, you need to start exercising. You need to start, meditating multiple times a week. You need to start doing this. You need to start doing that. And if you are really in a super down, depressed state, that's going to all feel really overwhelming. Half Smile, Willing Hands, yeah, it lowers the bar quite a bit to do those things, is how I think about it. And doing some mindfulness as well. As Kate and I talked about in our mindfulness episodes, we've talked about it, I think, at least a few times since then. You do not have to set aside 30 minutes to meditate to be practicing mindfulness. You can be mindful at any moment of your day about anything. So, all you have to do is just tune in and notice and observe what's going on outside of you, what's going on inside of you, but that can be something that we might, I don't know, perhaps look out the window and notice the sun shining, and that might have an impact on us, where if we weren't practicing mindfulness, we might overlook it. The other thing that we like, though, again, arguably this is setting a pretty high bar, but it's kind of the best thing I would say if you can get there, is to practice some of the contributing from accepts. So one of the C's in accept stands for contributing. And that is really getting outside of yourself to help someone else. This can look like formal volunteering, but it doesn't have to. This can look like texting a friend, hey, I hope that you're having a good day. That's contributing. This could be holding the door for someone if you're out in public. This can be, I don't know, doing your partner's dishes if you have time to do it and they didn't earlier and they were rushing out the door. This can look like a lot of different things to just contribute, but it can help get us outside of ourselves and to help us feel connected with other people. And that can really be a lovely antidote to feelings of emptiness. So those are the things we suggest there. Half Smile, Willing Hands, mindfulness, and contributing.
I like them. So let's see. Next one is listed as inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. I will own that this was not one of my particular criteria. I fall more into the category of those people that have a hard time accessing their anger and actually expressing it
at all.
My inappropriate anger expressions is that I inappropriately don't. Anger rather than expressing it too much, right? So this isn't one where I have a particular amount of in lived experience, not none. The I don't know if this happens for you, Michelle, at all, maybe not, but the counter side to the almost never expressing anger much at all is that on a few particularly not great times in my life, that has resulted in exploding instead. So
in what? Sorry,
exploding.
Yeah, sometimes. For me, I get super just in my head. I just ruminate like mad.
Yes. Yep. all
drives me
sorts of that.
crazy.
But every now and then, if
Yeah.
if I've been holding it in for too long and some situation keeps hammering at it, I tend to explode. Not great. And not frequent, but not great when it happens. But I know that there are a lot of people who have a lot of firsthand experience with this, right? Feeling angry, and part of you kind of knows that it maybe isn't appropriate, but you feel it anyway, or just once you are angry, it's so hard to stop being angry, or to tone it down, even if you consciously want to, right? It just is a particular emotion that you have a particularly hard time managing. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It shows up when you don't want it to. It's more intense than you want it to. It doesn't go away when you want it to. It kind of has a mind of its own. So I was looking at this, and I think we have the most skills, entertainingly, listed for this one than for any of the other ones, which is
That's
funny to me.
very interesting.
But I do mean them to be kind of grouped. So not like do each of these things, but there are a couple to start with and a few that you can then move on to. So the first two that I think about are stop and tip, right? Both of these are ones that, well, stop starts with, and I mean this literally, the first thing is stop.
I think that will always crack me up.
Right? Which is a great thing to do with anger, right? Is just to have a pause, right? So I think of stop as being lovely if you're not quite at wild anger, right? Or explosive anger, right? If you're getting pretty fucking angry, but you're not sort of out of your mind with anger yet, right? So I think the stop skill can be particularly useful there. If you're a little bit past that, if you're head first in the anger, then I think about tip. Again, right? Anytime we're in the wild extremes of an emotional response, tip to me is one of the better starting places. It's not, do I mean that? I rarely think of doing stop or tip and then nothing else. I think of tip most often as allowing you to get into a mental and emotional place where you can do other things. Whereas when you're so overwhelmingly in an emotional state, where it's just not reasonable or self-compassionate to expect yourself to do some of the more complicated skills, tip is a lovely starting place. So I think of stop and tip, and then once you've gotten to a place where you're better able to decide what your actions are going to be, have a little bit more control over your emotional responses, are able to be a little bit more, I guess I would say, contemplative, then I think of accepts, improve, and self-soothing. I say and, but to an extent or, right? What is going to be the most helpful for you, right? Accepts is full of distraction. Improve is also distracting, but with slightly different sort of bigger picture things. Self-soothing, as Michelle mentioned, is one of my top favorite skills, right? So if you've been, and I find it lovely for anger when I have gotten particularly angry. But whatever you feel like leaning into, I think any of those three, or to an extent a combination of them, can be lovely. But if you're really fucking angry, it may not be the place to start. You probably want to start with either tip or stop, just to get your brain on board, so you can engage in some of the more rational-sided skills, more thinky skills.
Yeah. Cool.
Ooh, you have the last one.
Very last one. We made it.
We made
9
it.
out of 9. So this very last one also, I will say, is maybe one of the ones that is not, depending on the severity of it, but might not be as easily recognizable as some of the others, or what people tend to think of when they think of BPD.
Yeah, I often have people that don't get this one. I think it's one of the less often checked boxes.
Yes, I agree with that. I've noticed that too. So what it says is transient, stress-related, paranoid ideation, or severe dissociative symptoms. So, a little bit of information here. Dissociation tends to fall into two categories: depersonalization and derealization. So what does that mean? Depersonalization kind of is the more extreme end of what I was talking about earlier, of like not really having that sense of self. But sometimes it can really look like people looking in the mirror and feeling like that doesn't look like me, like, or feeling like they are truly not really in their bodies, like what they are experiencing physically is not actually happening to them. It's a really more extreme end of just having an unstable sense of self, is just feeling like you are not actually yourself, is what that one generally means. And then derealization means kind of losing touch with time, place, that kind of a thing. So time passing and moving very differently, feeling easily maybe more confused or getting more lost in terms of just where you're going or what kinds of things you're doing throughout your day. It can look like you're really kind of disoriented and just out of touch with reality. So, as Kate said, and I agree, a lot of people don't check this box when it comes to BPD, but some people can, especially people who have a pretty significant trauma history. There's some overlap here with things that would fall under PTSD, because people who qualify for a PTSD diagnosis, one of that, I don't remember exactly how they phrase it, but one of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD is basically this. You can experience some dissociation. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. And what can help with that? Mindfulness. Again, in particular, really being mindful of your physical body and your activities, which probably looks like, in this case, super slowing down. Go real slow with yourself and be super patient, and you may need to just focus more energy on what it is that you are doing, because what you're doing is going to feel far more difficult if you're not in touch with who you are in that moment, or not in touch really with like where you are. So just go real slow with yourself, and checking the facts might also be a skill to go to. Check the facts is, as we've acknowledged before, that's a head skill, right? That's a thinking skill. So that may be difficult, but especially if you have somebody in your life who can like help you check the facts, or this probably isn't honestly going to look like the stereotypical way that DBT thinks about check the facts. But if you have some ways to kind of, certain questions to ask yourself, or certain ways to remind yourself that you are indeed yourself, you are in your body, where you are, I am in my home, those types of things. If you have certain things you can do to really ground yourself and bring you back to a place of feeling like you're in your body, or like you're more in touch with reality, some version of check the facts can help with that a little bit.
Awesome.
So, yeah. All right, Kate, onto your neuroscience stuff, which I'm so excited about.
Hilariously, I'm less excited than I normally am because I feel a bit daunted. So
I'm aware, because you and I talked about it before we recorded, but I know you're going to do great.
Thank you. I think no matter what I say, I will end up thinking that I said either too much or too little. So we'll just do our best.
Yep.
If I get nothing else across, the thing that I think is most important from this segment to me is just to say a surprising amount of borderline personality disorder symptoms, I guess you could say, symptomology, comes from differences in physiology, right? This is made up of a number of different elements. One of the numbers that I actually found, because I wanted some hard and fast numbers, so I was poking around today looking and doing some research before we recorded, is that there are studies now showing that 49 to 65% of the development of borderline personality disorder is genetic in nature, right? This is a lot of shit that's literally handed down to us, right? Without any interaction with the environment, just physiologically, what is our genetic makeup? And specifically, how then does that impact the physical structures of our brains? And in turn, the physical structures of our brains impact our neurotransmitters, right? The chemicals that are in our brains telling us what to do and how to think and feel, right? So the main takeaway that I want people to get from this is simply to go, this isn't just about, I don't know, childhood sexual trauma. This isn't just about having abusive parents. This isn't just about blank blank. Can those things be hugely impactful? A huge amount of how any one given individual might have developed borderline personality disorder? Absolutely. And also, I know that there are, I think, still professionals who don't think someone can get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder if they don't have trauma. There also, I know, are individuals who are like, I can't possibly have this diagnosis because I haven't had any trauma, right? And so I just want to normalize for any listeners out there that people who have been told they have BPD, or maybe have an inclination that they might have BPD but have doubted it because they don't have any trauma or abuse in their backgrounds, I want to say it can be basically that your brain was set up in a different way. It's another way of being, to use a term that's being used a lot more frequently these days, neurodivergent. So that's the overarching thing. Now I'm going to try and be just technical enough to be interesting and not technical enough to be talking over people's heads or boring. So the two, I guess I would say, well, nope, I'm going to back that up a little bit. The limbic system is it's not a part of the brain. It is several disparate parts of the brain that all interact together to basically regulate and formulate our emotional responses to the world around us. This is made up of a number of different parts of our brains, two of which are the hippocampus, which in large part is responsible for things having to do with our memories, encoding memories into long-term storage, things like that. As a brief aside, the hippocampus is something that is intensely impacted during trauma, like as you are experiencing trauma. So this is why a lot of people with trauma can't remember the trauma, because their hippocampus was offline during that time. So their memories might be hazy, or things when they're telling the story might be out of order, things like that, which often unfortunately leads to people not believing the person who was traumatized. Not the case. The hippocampus just goes kind of haywire when we're being traumatized. And so that has a big impact on that. And the other part that it has a huge impact on is our amygdala, which is more or less where fight or flight takes place. And then third, and separate a bit from the limbic system, but really important still, is it impacts our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's essentially responsible for the, hang on a second.
It's responsible for a lot.
It is. Yes, I think of it as the, hang on a second.
Yes, I like how you explain it that way, right?
Because the rest of our brain is all impulses and reactions and emotions and all this very primal and uncontrolled stuff. And then, ideally, our prefrontal cortex is there to go, wait. Maybe not. Maybe we don't do that thing. And it, as perhaps from the 9 things that we just listed above, the limbic system tends to be more reactive in people with borderline personality disorder. And the prefrontal cortex, when they do things like fMRIs and other imaging studies, the activity in the prefrontal cortex tends to be reduced. Right? So this is responsible for things like people having the unusually strong and longevity of emotions like fear and sadness and anger and shame, right? That is both experienced as larger and lasts for longer. This isn't actually listed in any of the criteria, but I don't know that I have known personally or professionally anyone with borderline personality disorder that doesn't talk about the idea of the emotions going for longer than even they think is appropriate. Like mentally, they're like, all right, the situation's done. Why am I not feeling different, right? Why is my emotion not following suit? And it's in large part due to the differences in these brain structures having to do with that. This can also, because of, again, the lack of activity in the prefrontal cortex, that has a lot to do with the impulsivity in all of those areas. right? Our hang on a second isn't working quite as well. And so a lot more stuff scooches out without getting caught or altered. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I really want to mention about the specific parts of the brain. They do notice that there's a lot more cortisol when they study the blood of folks that have borderline personality disorder, and cortisol is a stress response. Hormone, there we go, not chemical, hormone. So that shows that sort of chronically there's more emotional stress and stress responses, higher stress responses in people with borderline personality disorder. And a lot of what we're learning is that many of these things are there from birth, which in turn can have interesting impacts on our environment, right? If you have a baby, an infant, or even a toddler who is just way more emotional, right? People talk about having an easy baby. Think about the opposite, right? A really difficult baby cries all the time about anything forever, right? Huge emotional responses. That is hard to parent, right? Legitimately, that wears people down. That's hard. That's difficult, emotionally taxing. And that can impact then the nurture that person, that baby gets growing up, which can then lead to feedback loops, essentially, of either relatively benign, but still impactful parenting changes. Someone being exasperated or not validating emotions as much because they think that their kid just blows everything out of proportion, or right, there can be things that are relatively benign, but because of the brain structure to the person involved are more impactful than they might be on someone else, all the way up to and including abuse, right? Just shut the fuck up and stop crying, kid, right? So, that all being said, overarchingly, what DBT is meant to do is help with that, right? A lot of it is meant to help chill out the limbic system, right? So many of the DBT skills either directly, things like mindfulness and some of the other skills directly help to calm down the limbic system, or a lot of the ones where you're pausing, right? Either deliberately, like the stop skill, or just, it takes a fucking while to go through check the facts. Like, a pause is inherent in the process. You can't get all the way through check the facts without having spent an amount of time, right, before you react. So a lot of those things are meant to address calming down the limbic system, or at least giving the limbic system time to calm down. And then the other side of it is helping to strengthen the prefrontal cortex. Again, mindfulness meditation that helps increase connections and connectivity within the prefrontal cortex. So that on a very physiological basis, it is actually helping to change the structure of the brain in a way that is positively, has a positive impact for those with borderline personality disorder. Well, and everybody else, because come on, who couldn't use a little bit more of their hang on a second, on average. But also, thinking, right? It's the more intellectual, right? This is our, if you think about like the brain developed sort of from the back to the front, right? This is our more intellectual, coldly
This is
logical,
the part that
rational,
doesn't fully develop till we're 25. The prefrontal cortex.
Yep. Yeah. Ever wonder why teenagers are impulsive assholes? I was one, so I can say it. There you go. And all my nephews are. Right. So, thinking helps you think. I know that sounds tautological, but some of those more, what's the word you used for it, Michelle? More like the skills where you have to think harder. They're less.
Oh yeah, like just the head skills.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah, sure.
all the thinking skills.
Yep, all the thinking skills bring your prefrontal cortex more online. Right. And so
it gets to have practice. It's like exercising it.
Yes, exactly. And trauma and or large emotional responses on average tend to shut it down. You just get less activity in the prefrontal cortex when you're in a heightened emotional state, which is why I very lovingly say that being flooded with any emotion makes you stupid. It's not a judgment. It just means your prefrontal cortex sort of powers down when you're intensely emotional enough. Right? So doing something that makes you think sort of brute force turns your prefrontal cortex back on. And so you have it more available to you to appropriately hang on a second. So there's a lot more I could say. There's a lot of really interesting shit online if you just Google things like borderline personality disorder neurobiology. So if you're someone who really wants to dive, pardon the slight pun, head first into more of the information on the differences, the physiological brain differences between people with borderline personality disorder and those without, there's a lot of great information out there. But I'm going to keep myself from talking forever and pass it on to Michelle now, I think.
Nice. No, I really like everything you shared because, we talk about in the world of psychology and just human beings, this idea of nature versus nurture is, I think, how they've said it for a long time. But with so many things, what has come to light over the years is that it really is nature and nurture. It's a combo.
And they affect each other, right? They go back and forth.
Exactly.
Yep.
Excuse me. So I just think you spoke really nicely to the nature side of things, about how some of this stuff is really present from birth, and then as people grow up, it can look like, the criteria that we talked about at the beginning of the episode. So yeah, I'm going to speak a little more to the nurture side of things. Kate was touching on this quite a bit when she was speaking about how trauma can affect the brain similarly to how it looks with BPD. And also how it is basically very commonly thought of in the mental health field that trauma can play a role in the development of BPD. And trauma, this episode, right, is about BPD. This is not an episode about trauma. Kate and I may very well wind up doing an episode about like PTSD stuff at some point when we get to it in our new podcast of The Couch and the Chair.
Or even a future monthly episode. Ooh.
Or a future monthly episode, that's true. Maybe we will wind up talking about it a little bit here. But I want to talk about a term that's come up, really more in probably the last 3 to 5 years. I don't know if it was around too much before that, which is complex PTSD, or CPTSD. If you need a reminder, PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. So with post-traumatic stress disorder, there is a lot of criteria out there. Like in the DSM, there's 4 or 5 different sections, and it's like the client has to have 2 from this and at least 1 from that, and pretty intense thing to diagnose. And complex PTSD is not listed in the current version of the DSM. It is not a formal diagnosis that has criteria attached to it. I think there were talks about putting it into this most recent version of the DSM.
Because isn't it in the ICD-10?
I am not sure.
All right, you talk, I look.
Okay, you look. Yeah, the ICD-10 is really like looking at the medical diagnoses side of things. But basically, complex PTSD is a term that's come up more and more in recent years, recognizing that there's another way to view trauma, and kind of almost in a way like another type of trauma. And when I talk about this with people, when they're like, well, what is complex PTSD? And then what is just kind of run-of-the-mill normal PTSD, if we want to call it that, there's a couple key things that distinguish it. PTSD at its core, which again, I'm not going to get into all the criteria here today, but PTSD, one of the first and foremost criteria for that is that you had to have experienced an event where you were either experiencing bodily harm, there was a threat of bodily harm to you, or that you witnessed somebody else experiencing bodily harm. And that's not reading it straight from the DSM, that's just Michelle's own words. But roughly that's one of the key things that it talks about, is that you had to have experienced an event where there was either a threat or you were actually harmed or witnessed someone being harmed. And a lot of times that can look like a one-time occurrence. So certain events that could lead to someone later having PTSD type symptoms. Still a common way that it's thought of is soldiers off fighting in a war, right? You witness one of your comrades being shot in combat. that would potentially be an event that qualifies for PTSD diagnosis. Or you are shot or harmed in some way pretty significantly. This can look like being in a really bad car accident and experiencing injuries from that, and then having trauma responses afterwards where now you're scared to drive. This can look like a one-time sexual assault. This can look like a serious bodily injury of some kind in a horrific accident. I mean, this can look like so many things, but the idea with PTSD is that a lot of times, hopefully, your life is generally going along pretty okay. And then this thing happens. And then after that, you start to experience all these different mental health symptoms as a result of that traumatic event occurring. That's what we're talking about with PTSD. With complex PTSD, the biggest difference that I think of with it is that it is chronic. So with run-of-the-mill PTSD, it's more acute, right? It's this sometimes one-time occurrence that happened. But complex PTSD typically results when you are experiencing chronic trauma or chronic major stressors. So this could look like, I'm going to probably speak mostly to childhood examples, though it can certainly develop in adulthood, but more commonly, these things tend to unfortunately happen to children from a young age. This can look like growing up in a household with a parent who's an alcoholic. And you never know on any given day if that parent is going to become physically abusive, what they're going to say to you, if they're going to, pass out at the end of the night. You just never quite know what's going to happen. This can look like experiencing ongoing sexual abuse. Some people, and this is not to compare, any kind of sexual abuse is tragic and awful. Some people experience sexual abuse one time. Some people experience sexual abuse daily for years. So those are going to affect us differently. And there's actually been, which I did not look up the neuroscience research behind this, because again, this isn't an episode about trauma, but our brain gets affected differently, whether it's a one-time trauma or ongoing trauma. Our brain adapts and adjusts. If you know that every single day you're going to be experiencing some type of trauma, your brain is going to be impacted by that in a different way than, again, the person who's going along and their life is pretty okay, and then bam, out of the blue one day, a trauma occurs. I think about, unfortunately for my husband, which I may have mentioned on the podcast or maybe not, but he was burned when he was 6. That, right, would be a PTSD type of event. And also, then after that, he was unfortunately, because a large percentage of his body was burned and so he was left with scars, he was bullied horrifically daily from that point on throughout much of his time in school. That is complex PTSD. So I hope that kind of gives some examples of what the difference is. Complex PTSD tends to be more ongoing, rather than a one-time, pretty significant, crazy event. So with complex PTSD and BPD, what's the relationship here? As Kate said, not everybody with a BPD diagnosis has complex PTSD. I will just speak from my own experience as a therapist, my own clients that I've worked with since becoming a therapist. Every single one of my clients with a BPD diagnosis also has complex PTSD. That's my experience, right? So a big part of what we do in therapy is we talk about that trauma. And because it's complex, it's ongoing, it was just kind of unfortunately part of their daily life, people don't always view it as trauma. Because it wasn't that thing that just came out of the sky one day and, shattered their life as they knew it. It's just what they always kind of knew. They always knew that they had a parent who unfortunately would physically abuse them. They just always knew that. They just always knew what it was like to every single day not know when their next meal was coming from. That was just their norm. So they don't connect those dots necessarily between how that is trauma and how that might affect them later in life. The other thing that we'll tend to see sometimes with people diagnosed with BPD is, again, trauma that's like really relational type of trauma. So trauma that involves another person is very common when you're looking at people who have a BPD diagnosis. If you are driving along one day and you get into a terrible car accident that leaves you, I don't know, paralyzed from the waist down, oh my gosh, that is some major trauma. But that's not relational trauma. That didn't involve another person. Relational trauma is really, we're talking about any kind of abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, domestic violence. That's what we're talking about with interpersonal trauma. The trauma that you experienced was at the hands of another person. You were the victim of trauma that was perpetrated by somebody else. That type of trauma is commonly seen with a BPD diagnosis, and you might be able to connect those dots between some of the criteria that we talked about earlier, where it comes to having fears of abandonment. If you experienced a lot of abandonment in childhood, those fears can stick with you when you become an adult and then you're in a romantic relationship. If your parents were, you can never really count on your parents, you're probably going to have some fears about being able to count on a partner. So there are these threads that can sometimes be seen between complex PTSD, the ongoing chronic type of trauma that can take place a lot of times in childhood, and the stuff that we see with BPD later in adulthood. So some people have talked about, let's get rid of the diagnosis borderline personality disorder and let's just call it complex PTSD, because a lot of people say that that's really what it is. But as Kate said, there are many people who have an experience of, being diagnosed with BPD without the trauma stuff. And then there's many people who, because of the trauma they've experienced, that's led to them having a BPD diagnosis. But it can be a little more destigmatizing to look at it as something that can, for many people, be a result of trauma they experience. That this is not them just being an asshole to the people in their lives. This is because they've experienced a hard childhood or because of other things. And that's why learning the skills of DBT can be really helpful, because these are things that they may have not learned in their childhood. Especially if, like, Kate has alluded to, and mentioned briefly that her mom had a diagnosis of BPD. But, again, a lot of times when I talk with my clients with BPD, boy, do their parents have a whole bunch of stuff going on too. A lot of the time. And Kate let me know, she typed in our notes that this is an ICD-10 diagnosis. So this is something that I think is being kind of more further investigated.
ICD-11 now.
Oh, how fancy. Yeah, so this is something that's emerging in the mental health community, but it felt really important just to mention what it is today on the episode and how there can be this crossover with people who have experienced trauma like that and then receiving a BPD diagnosis. There is certainly a correlation there for a lot of people, and that can really help with reframing it and being forgiving and kind and understanding of yourself when you can look at, oh, the reason why I do these things or act this way, I can see where that comes from a little bit. So anyways, I'm going to stop talking now because I've been talking for a while. The other thing we wanted to say real quick with monthly episodes, because normally this is the time of the episode where I would be like, so this is your homework. Homework. No more. Well, not really. Keep using skills, you guys, but we're not going to be giving specific homework, at least not for this monthly episode. I was going to say
probably not. We don't know. Don't fence us in for the future. No, I'm joking.
Yes, who knows? Not this time anyways, because this is our first time doing a monthly episode. We're not going to do any homework this time because not all of our listeners are diagnosed with BPD, and I don't know, what would the homework necessarily even be? Talk to your therapist? That kind of a thing. Keep processing this. Keep using your skills. So there's not really any homework closing out this episode. So Kate's just going to do awkward self-promotion and
self-promotion
closing
time.
moment.
I feel like we ought to have like a little jingle there, right? That we could just play the little
I know.
clip.
You say it every time. Maybe one day.
Maybe one day. Anyway, so awkward self-promotion. First off, thank you to our new Patreon patrons, Ellie, Tom, Opal, and Rose. We want to say a big thank you to you guys.
Thank you to all of you.
Right? Thank you. We appreciate you. Also, because we know that we are lowering the quantity of our upcoming content, if you do not feel like going and becoming a patron with ongoing support, we do want to let everybody know that available as a one-time purchase on Etsy for $7.50 is the DBT sort of journaling / workbook that we created. So you can go to our Etsy shop, which is just go to Etsy and search for DBT and me. And you can purchase that workbook. On the other hand, if you do feel like joining Patreon, not only will you get that workbook, but, and this is a sort of vague sell here because we don't want to give it away yet, but you will also get some content that we're creating for the new podcast that we're starting, called The Couch and the Chair. So incentives still exist.
Yes.
For doing the Patreon. Okay, guys, time for closing moment. So, as always, just start by getting yourself into some sort of comfortable position. This can be sitting, standing, laying down, walking around, whatever feels good to you and your body right now. And if you're safe and feel comfortable doing so, I also invite you to go ahead and close your eyes. We're going to begin now by simply tuning into our breathing. You don't have to breathe any more slowly or any more deeply than you do naturally. It's just about paying attention. It's just about noticing the sensations and the rhythms of our breathing and letting them welcome us into the present moment and into our bodies. So now, today, we're going to work a little bit on some expressions of self-compassion. So first and foremost, if it feels good and comfortable to you, I would love it if everybody could go ahead and put a hand just on their chest, just over their heart. This can be over your clothing or skin to skin, whatever feels better and safer and happier for you. And as you do that, I would like you to bring to mind an image of yourself. Just take a moment and picture yourself standing perhaps in front of you. You can imagine yourself really however you like, whatever clothing or whatever age. Well, I'd prefer it if it was you at this age, but whatever comes to mind and feels natural is still all right. And now in your mind, seeing yourself, I'd like you to walk towards yourself and give a big hug. And just try and feel that. Just like with your hand on your chest, you are both the toucher, the one touching, and you are also the one being touched. In this embrace in your mind's eye, I want you to lean into the feeling that you are the one both giving and receiving this hug. There are a lot of mental exercises that we might do where we can lean into self-compassion. And I think they all, in essence, boil down to this. This idea of being the one to both give and receive love, affection, attention, compassion. tenderness, understanding, right? Lean into this moment, lean into this sensation that you are giving to yourself and receiving from yourself all this care that you may need in this moment. Now you know what you may be going through in your life right now, and I cannot. But if it feels right, if you feel drawn to it, you may also try saying something to yourself right now. Something that you really need to hear. Just whisper it gently into your own ear. And again, recognizing that you are giving and receiving this reassurance, this encouragement, this word or phrase, whatever it may be, that you need in this moment. Both to feel what it feels like to be giving and receiving this compassion, and also to remind yourself that you can give yourself this compassion. While we may not always have access to anyone else, we may not be able to rely on compassion or reassurance or tenderness or encouragement from someone else. We are by definition always here. We are available to give these things to ourselves, if we can allow it. And so spend a moment, either in silence with yourself, or continuing to say whatever yourself may need to hear. And I'll just be quiet for a moment here so you can feel that, hear that, be that in this moment. Now, you can choose to stay in this place if you need it, if you want it. You can hang out here for however long feels right and good and necessary for you. But if you feel ready to move out of that space, I invite you to go ahead and let go of that hug. And as you do, let the image of yourself fade from your mind's eye. Before you remove your hand from your chest, just take a moment to thank yourself for having given yourself this moment. And then go ahead and do, as per usual, whatever stretches might feel good and necessary to your body, just to help yourself exit the imagination and come back into the room. And whenever you feel ready, you can go ahead and open your eyes. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.